For years, they waited for a ship that never came. Their children wore clothes cut from old sails. They kept a calendar so carefully that they were only 2 days off, yet they no longer knew what year it was. Then the last adult man on the island took the only rifle and began making his own rules. The strangest part is how this nightmare finally ended. The place was called Clipperton Island. Calling it an island makes it sound much friendlier than it really was. Clipperton is a narrow ring of sand and broken coral sitting alone in the eastern Pacific, hundreds of miles from the Mexican coast. In some places, a person can walk from one side of the land to the other in a few minutes. Inside the ring sits a stagnant lagoon. Outside, it is nothing but ocean. There are no rivers, no permanent freshwater springs, no neighboring towns, and no convenient place to walk when you decide that island life has lost its charm. People did not settle there because anyone dreamed of raising a family on a strip of coral in the middle of nowhere. They came because of bird droppings. That sounds ridiculous until you remember what agriculture looked like before modern industrial fertilizer became cheap and abundant. Guano and phosphate deposits were valuable. They could enrich exhausted farmland and feed an industry that was worth serious money. A place that looked useless to a traveler could look very different to a company accountant. British interests worked the phosphate deposits, while Mexico maintained a presence on the island. Workers arrived, soldiers arrived. Then wives and children arrived. Houses were built, pigs were kept, small gardens were attempted, and schoolwork continued for the children. People created all the little routines human beings create when they are trying to convince themselves that a temporary outpost is actually a community. For a while, it almost worked. The Mexican officer in charge was Ramon Arnaud. His career had not followed a clean, straight line. As a young soldier, he had deserted, been caught, spent months in military prison, and lost his rank. He later rebuilt his career, served in Yucatan, traveled on an official assignment to Japan, and eventually received command of Clipperton. It was technically a military appointment, although it probably felt less like commanding a strategic fortress and more like managing a sun-baked parking lot surrounded by sharks. There was also a lighthouse. A lighthouse needed a keeper, and the man assigned to it was Victoriano Alvarez. He lived apart from the main settlement, near the highest point on the island, and came down only when necessary. At the time, this was just an administrative detail. Somebody had to maintain the light. Years later, that job would matter for a reason nobody could have predicted. As long as ships arrived, the colony remained connected to civilization. Flour came in, rice came in, mail came in. Clothes, medicine, tools, and news could arrive from Mexico. A person could complain to a superior, a sick child could theoretically be taken away, and orders could come from the mainland. Government existed because ships proved that government existed. Then, Mexico began tearing itself apart. The Mexican Revolution turned the mainland into a political and military disaster. Governments changed, armies fought, presidents rose and fell, and supply systems broke down. In the middle of all that, a tiny military outpost far out in the Pacific became very easy to forget. The supply ship came less often. Then the gaps became longer. Eventually, the people on Clipperton realized that the ship was not simply late, it might not be coming at all. They were not completely abandoned yet. That is one of the most painful parts of the story, because there was a moment when the entire disaster could have ended before it really began. In 1914, the American cruiser Cleveland reached Clipperton. The United States sailors brought supplies and news. Mexico was in chaos. Europe was sliding into a major war, and the Americans offered to evacuate the people on the island. This was the open door. Families could have packed what they could carry. Children could have gone aboard. The settlement could have been closed and the lighthouse abandoned until somebody decided what to do with it. Clipperton could have gone back to being what nature clearly wanted it to be, a place for seabirds and crabs rather than military families. Ramon Arnaud refused. His reasoning was not completely irrational. He was an officer of Mexico. He had been ordered to hold the post, and nobody had officially ordered him to abandon it. Leaving could weaken the Mexican claim to the island. He also believed that a Mexican supply vessel would eventually arrive. Military discipline makes more sense when headquarters is still answering the telephone. On Clipperton, there was no telephone. The American ship left. There are decisions that look reasonable when they are made, and insane only after you know what happened next. Arnaud could not see the future. He did not know that the political chaos in Mexico would continue, or how thoroughly his colony would disappear from the list of problems anybody had time to solve. He did not know that the ship he had just allowed to leave might have been the last easy escape his people would ever see. So life continued, because human beings are very good at continuing. People rationed what remained and kept waiting. They told themselves that another ship would come. The children still needed to be fed, food still needed to be cooked, and clothes still needed to be repaired. The sun came up every morning whether Mexico remembered them or not. Then the stored food began to disappear. Flour ran out, rice ran out, preserved foods disappeared, and anything that depended on regular supply from the mainland became precious before becoming a memory. At first, this should not have meant starvation. Clipperton was surrounded by life. Fish were abundant, seabirds nested in enormous numbers, and were so unused to serious human predators that they could often be approached easily. Eggs could be collected, and crabs covered parts of the island. A person could eat until the stomach was full and still die from malnutrition. That is exactly what began to happen. Men who had been strong became weak. Their gums swelled and started bleeding. Bruises appeared with almost no cause, teeth loosened, and old wounds could begin to break down again. People became exhausted after tasks they once performed without thinking. The colony was eating, but the colony was also slowly falling apart. The disease was scurvy. Today, scurvy feels like something that belongs beside wooden sailing ships, powdered wigs, and maps with sea monsters in the corners. For the people on Clipperton, it was not history. It was chemistry happening inside their bodies. Humans need vitamin C, and the amount is small, which makes the consequences of losing it feel almost unfair. Most animals can manufacture vitamin C inside their own bodies. Humans cannot. Somewhere deep in our evolutionary history, our ancestors lost a working part of the biochemical machinery needed to make it. That was not much of a problem as long as those ancestors regularly ate food containing vitamin C. Move their descendants onto a coral ring, where the menu becomes fish, birds, eggs, and whatever else can be caught, and the old evolutionary bargain suddenly looks terrible. Vitamin C is essential for making normal collagen. Collagen is part of the structural material that helps hold together skin, blood vessels, gums, ligaments, and many other tissues. Think of it as reinforcement inside a building. You do not notice the reinforcement when it is working. You notice it when walls begin cracking. Without enough vitamin C, blood vessels become fragile. Bleeding appears. Wounds heal badly. Gums deteriorate. Teeth loosen. Weakness becomes severe. And eventually the body can fail. The cruel part was that there was food everywhere. There just was not the right food. Fish provided protein. Birds provided protein and fat. Eggs provided calories. Crabs could fill a pot. None of that solved the specific nutritional problem destroying the colony. There were coconuts, but not enough to provide a reliable answer for everyone. A tropical island sounds generous when somebody says the word coconut. It sounds different when one coconut has to be divided among hungry adults and children, and nobody knows when the next one will appear. The men began dying. It is tempting to explain exactly why adult men disappeared before the women and children, but the surviving records do not give one clean scientific answer. The men performed much of the heavy physical labor and had higher energy requirements. Families may also have protected children and women by giving them part of the better food when possible. Whatever combination of factors mattered most, the result was visible. The military force was shrinking, and the colony was losing more than muscle. It was losing structure. As long as several armed men exist, power is divided. One person cannot simply decide that every rule has changed because there are other weapons, other adults who can object, a commander, and soldiers. Scurvy was removing those limits one human being at a time. Then somebody saw a ship. For people who had spent months staring at an empty horizon, the sight of a vessel meant almost everything they had been waiting for. Food, medicine, news, rescue. Arnaud and several of the last soldiers launched a boat and tried to reach it. What happened next is one of the places where the historical record becomes uncertain. In one version, the ship may have been a mirage seen by exhausted men. A fight broke out in the boat, and the boat overturned. In another version, there was a real ship and no fight, but the weakened men were unable to control the boat in dangerous water. The details differ, the ending does not. The women on shore watched the last soldiers drown. Ramon Arnaud was gone. The military command was gone. The remaining adult men were gone, except for one, Victoriano Alvarez. The lighthouse keeper who had spent much of the disaster apart from the main settlement now came down into a community of women and children whose husbands, fathers, and soldiers were dead. He collected the weapons that remained. Most were thrown away or destroyed. He kept a rifle. That rifle changed the mathematics of the island. A rifle does not normally make a man a king. In an American town, a man with a rifle still has neighbors, police, courts, roads, telephones, vehicles, and people who can leave. Other people may also be armed. The owner of one gun does not automatically become the government. Clipperton had none of those protections. There was no police department over the hill, no sheriff 20 minutes away, no courthouse, no highway, and no radio call that could bring help. There was only ocean, hundreds of miles of it. Alvarez understood what that meant. The surviving women later described a period of fear and abuse. Alvarez forced women to work for him and used control of the rifle to enforce his authority. Accounts accuse him of sexual violence and of killing women who resisted him or became inconvenient. It is easy to turn this part of the story into a cheap tale about a mad king. That actually makes the story less interesting. Alvarez did not need a throne. He needed a monopoly. Every institution that could have limited him had disappeared. Mexico could not reach the island. The officers were dead. The soldiers were dead. Escape was nearly impossible, and the only firearm was under his control. The ocean did the work of prison walls. The rifle did the work of law. This is why Clipperton is more disturbing than a simple story about one violent man. The island shows what happens when ordinary restraints around power vanish piece by piece. First, the supply system disappeared. Then communication with the mainland became meaningless. Then normal nutrition disappeared. Then health collapsed. Then the soldiers died. Then the possibility of armed resistance disappeared. At no single moment did somebody announce that civilization had ended. It simply became thinner every day. The women still had one advantage. There were more of them. They could talk, observe Alvarez, wait, and decide when the risk of fighting became smaller than the risk of doing nothing. Meanwhile, they had to keep children alive. Food still had to be found. Clothes still had to cover growing bodies. Salt, sun, wind, and constant use destroyed fabric. So eventually, old sails from a wrecked vessel became material for clothing. Imagine cutting up sailcloth and trying to turn it into something a child can wear in tropical heat. That was normal life now. The survivors also tried to keep track of time. They made a calendar and marked the passing of each day. It was an almost absurd act of order on an island where nearly every larger system of order had failed. When the Americans eventually arrived, the survivors had kept the date with remarkable accuracy and were off by only about 2 days. Then they asked what year it was. That detail may be the best measure of their isolation. They knew Tuesday from Wednesday, but they no longer knew where history was. By 1917, the United States had entered World War I. American troops were preparing to cross the Atlantic. German submarines were one of the great fears of the war, and governments were tracking ships, radio stations, and possible enemy activity across enormous distances. On Clipperton, the survivors reportedly did not even understand how much the outside world had changed. Their last newspaper was years old. Outside, presidents had changed and millions of soldiers were moving across continents. Inside Clipperton, the most important political question was, who had the rifle? By the summer of 1917, Alicia Rovira de Arnaud, the widow of Ramon Arnaud, and Tirsa Rendon had reached the point where waiting no longer looked safer than resistance. They went to confront Alvarez. Tirsa carried a hammer. The exact details vary slightly between later accounts, but the basic sequence is consistent. Alvarez tried to defend himself. An axe or another weapon was involved. One of the children ran toward the house where the rifle could be found. The rifle was no longer needed. Tirsa struck Alvarez with the hammer. The man who had controlled the island through possession of the only firearm was killed with one of the simplest hand tools humans have used for thousands of years. His rule ended within minutes. Then somebody looked toward the horizon. There was smoke. A ship was coming. If this were fiction, an editor might reject the scene as too convenient, too obvious, too perfect. Real history did not ask permission. The ship was the USS Yorktown. It was not approaching Clipperton because the women had managed to send a distress call. There had been no distress call. The Americans did not even know that a desperate group of survivors was waiting there. The United States Navy was operating in the region during World War I and investigating concerns about possible German activity in the Eastern Pacific. Remote islands could potentially serve as places for radio stations, supply points, or support for submarines. The Yorktown came toward Clipperton, looking for signs connected to a global war, and instead found women and children who had been living outside that global war. The timing was extraordinary. Alvarez had been killed that morning, and the ship appeared the same day. Had the women waited a little longer, American sailors might have arrived while Alvarez was still alive. Had the Yorktown arrived earlier, the final confrontation might never have happened. The women could not know that. This is what disappears when we read history backward. We know the ship is coming. They did not. From their point of view, the Pacific had been empty for years. The first attempt by the Americans to reach shore did not immediately solve the problem. The surf around Clipperton could be dangerous, and a boat sent from the Yorktown approached, but had difficulty landing and turned back. Imagine what that looked like from the beach. After years of waiting, an American ship had finally appeared. A boat came toward them. Then the boat turned around. According to the account later recorded by the commander of the Yorktown, the women believed that their last chance was leaving. The despair became so extreme that there was talk of killing the children and walking into the sea rather than remaining trapped on the island. The Americans had not abandoned them. They were trying to find a safer way in. The boat returned, and this time the sailors reached the survivors. There were 11 people left to rescue, women and children. The people who met the Americans did not look like residents of a tropical paradise. Years of poor nutrition and isolation had left marks on everybody. One boy was almost 12 years old, but looked much younger because of malnutrition. He carried a small child who could no longer walk for a distance of more than 2 miles to reach the place where the Americans could take them aboard. Think about that for a moment. A hungry child carrying another hungry child across a strip of coral because the adults around them were barely able to function. Nobody on the Yorktown needed a long explanation after seeing that. The sailors began helping the survivors aboard. For the children, the ship itself must have looked like another planet. Clean equipment, uniforms, stored food, soap, metal everywhere, and men who had not spent years eating whatever could be caught with bare hands. Then came one of the strangest little scenes in the entire story. American sailors gave the children sweets, and one child received a box of marshmallows. Marshmallows are about as ordinary an American treat as you can imagine. Soft, white sugar, something a child at a picnic might eat without even remembering it the next day. The boy did not know what to do with them. According to the American account, he took the marshmallows out and threw them overboard one by one. Then he kept the empty box. The candy meant nothing to him. The box was useful. You could hold things in a box. You could play with a box. After years on Clipperton, that made more sense than soft pieces of sugar. The adults carried their own relics from the life they had once lived. Alicia still possessed Mexican money and jewelry, including diamonds. Years earlier, those objects represented wealth. On Clipperton, they were nearly meaningless. A diamond could not call a ship. A banknote could not cure scurvy. Neither could persuade a coconut to fall from a tree. The island had created its own economy. Food was wealth. Cloth was wealth. A usable tool was wealth. A rifle had been political power. Even something as simple as a bar of soap could become precious because you could actually do something with it. Money only works when there is another human being willing to accept it. Clipperton had reduced economics to the version that existed before anybody invented coins. The sailors of the Yorktown gave the survivors clothes and supplies. Members of the crew collecting money for them. The rescue was not simply a matter of pulling people from a beach and continuing the mission. The condition of the survivors clearly affected the Americans who met them. Then came another scene that belongs in a movie, but happened in real life. The commander of the Yorktown arranged for word to be sent ahead as the ship carried the survivors toward Mexico. Alicia's father had spent years trying to learn what had happened to his daughter and grandchildren. He had been told that everyone on Clipperton was dead. Not missing. Dead. Then a message arrived saying they were alive. When the father finally came aboard and saw his daughter and grandchildren, the reunion affected even sailors who had spent their lives around ships, storms, weapons, and military discipline. Some of them reportedly cried. The story could end there. It does not, because we still have not answered why these families had been living on Clipperton in the first place, and the answer makes the whole disaster more bitter. The phosphate deposits mattered, and the lighthouse mattered, but the people also mattered politically. Mexico and France both claimed Clipperton. In an international territorial dispute, planting a flag on an empty rock is not always enough. Governments strengthen claims by showing actual occupation and administration. A lighthouse helps. A military detachment helps. Families living there help. Ramon Arnaud and the people around him were not simply settlers. Their existence was evidence. They were a human argument in an international property dispute. Mexico and France eventually agreed to submit the dispute to arbitration, and the arbitrator was King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. The process moved at the speed international legal disputes sometimes move when none of the people writing documents are trapped on the territory being discussed. Years passed. The Clipperton colony collapsed. The survivors were rescued. Children grew up, governments changed, and the island remained. Then in 1931, the decision finally came. France received sovereignty over Clipperton. Think about the timing. The Mexican soldiers had lived there to maintain Mexican presence. Their families had endured isolation. Arnaud had rejected an American evacuation, partly because abandoning the post would mean abandoning that presence. Men died, and women and children survived years of misery. 14 years after the rescue, the island was awarded to France anyway. Government strategy can look very different from the beach than it does on a map. There is another strange American footnote. During World War II, the United States military again became interested in Clipperton because remote Pacific islands mattered in a completely different war. American personnel established a weather and observation presence there for a period of time. The island that had once trapped forgotten Mexican families became useful again because another generation of governments had another strategic problem. Then the soldiers left. That may be the most consistent character in the whole story. People keep arriving on Clipperton because a government, company, or navy decides the island matters. Then the reason changes, and Clipperton is still there. Today nobody lives there permanently. The island remains a French possession thousands of miles from France. Scientific expeditions occasionally visit. Wreckage rusts near the shore. Seabirds dominate the landscape again. Crabs move across the sand as if the arguments of Mexico, France, Britain, Germany, and the United States were weather events that passed through and disappeared. But the most unsettling part of the Clipperton story is not the international dispute. It is not even Alvarez. It is how ordinary everything looked while the system was collapsing. The colony did not wake up one morning and discover that law had vanished. Law disappeared in pieces. First, the supply ships stopped coming. Then messages from the mainland stopped mattering. Then food became incomplete. Then bodies weakened. Then armed men disappeared. Then there was only one rifle. Every step made the next step possible. That matters because people often imagine civilization as something solid. Roads, police, courts, stores, money, electricity, schools, military uniforms. They feel permanent because most of us have never watched all of them vanish one after another. Clipperton strips them away. Alicia could have diamonds and still be poor. Arnaud could have military rank and still be unable to summon a ship. A child could know the date and not know the year. A colony could have enough food to fill stomachs and still die from malnutrition. A man who had never been elected to anything could become the most powerful person for hundreds of miles because he possessed one working rifle. None of those things required the people on the island to become a different species. They remained human. The environment around them changed. That is also why the final act was not a sudden miracle of courage. The women had been calculating risk the entire time. While Alvarez controlled the rifle, resistance could mean immediate death. Doing nothing could also mean death, but perhaps tomorrow, rather than today. People tolerate terrible conditions when the alternative looks worse. Then the calculation changes. At some point, the danger of obedience becomes greater than the danger of resistance. A hammer becomes worth using against a rifle. Tirsa Rendon did not know the Yorktown was coming. Alicia did not know an American boat would reach the beach that day. Nobody knew that sailors searching for signs of German wartime activity were already moving toward them. From the island, the horizon looked exactly as empty as it had looked the day before, so they acted inside the world they knew. A world with no police, no court, no rescue ship, no husband coming back, and no government that had answered. There was one man, one rifle, and ocean in every direction. Then the hammer fell. Almost immediately after it did, smoke appeared on the horizon. For years, they had waited for the outside world to return. It returned only after they had finally stopped waiting.